All right. Well, I'm back. This is episode number 5, I think. Um, Last exam went pretty good. I can't complain. Yeah, it turned out well. So obviously I don't know. I don't think it was exactly like the listening and watching the videos after doing them that helped me more. I think it was more just the process of talking through this and trying to memorize it for the video. So I've kind of memorized it like a script, I guess, and it seemed to help. At least I'm gonna try it. So yeah, it's been a couple weeks, and we're gearing up for exam 2. We posted the exam, the study guide for exam 2 here. I think it was about a little under a week ago tomorrow. So yeah, spent the last week kind of working through it when I could, and definitely this one, I feel like I've put a lot more time into this one than I had to on the last one. This one pretty heavy. Yeah, definitely didn't go down without a fight. And there's still a few on here I actually haven't even gotten done yet, actually. So it's material. There's a couple, yeah, like I said, that we haven't even covered in class. So I've looked at them and I've kind of, I've gone through the readings and stuff, but still not 100%. I don't know. I'll probably go through them here this week, or I might go to office hours and ask about them too. Yeah, there's definitely a few I want to ask about. And yeah, so this is the first run through of study guide number 2. It's definitely going to be clunky and yeah, probably won't be very well articulated, and so yeah. No PowerPoint really to go with this one. Not yet, at least. I'm sure maybe as I go through this, I'll kind of think of some things I might want to have that PowerPoint for, because it did help on the last one having the PowerPoint for especially like explaining how the checkerboard pattern and stuff, and so yeah. So I'll probably come up with one maybe later, but for now I just got the original Bureau of Land Management logo. I think it is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I'm not gonna lie. Something about this. I mean, it doesn't exactly scream multiple use, but it looks so dang cool. I mean, it is. I don't know what it is exactly. Like those dudes just look. I don't know. This thing looks. It's an awesome logo. If anyone knows if there's like I can get a shirt of this somewhere, I don't know. I'm gonna make a shirt with this logo on it because it is, like I said, it is probably the coolest thing I've ever seen. I don't know why they switched away from. I mean, I know why they switched away from it, and we'll kind of touch on it. I mean, it ties in with some of the material we cover here, so it's kind. I mean, it is relevant, but this is kind of what, the transition from this to where we are now is a big part of this exam too. How we got to where we are now from this, I guess, managing land for these uses here. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any other notes I got. I mean, like I said, the last exam for exam 1 went pretty good. I can't complain. Can't complain about it. So I'm gonna try to do this again for exam 2. Learn some lessons with the recordings with exam 1. I've kind of learned where to stand. I hope I'm standing in a good spot for audio. Yeah, and so, let's just. I guess I might as well just get started with this. I'm gonna grab a quick sip of water before. I don't know. My mouth just dries out like crazy doing this. I don't know how. I don't know how professors go. An hour or hour 20, just talking. I'd be. I'd be so dehydrated by the end of the day, or I'd have to go into the bathroom a ton because I'd be, drinking so much water. But anyway, getting off topic. So I'm just gonna get rolling here. Like I said, there's a few on here I haven't done. I just haven't done yet. But for the most part, I've gone through and answered all the questions. At least got a general answer, and going through this will help me articulate and smooth them out a bit. And hopefully, within a week, by a week or so from now, I'll be able to kind of, I'll have them trimmed down and a little more ironed out, some of these answers. So, yeah, I guess I'll just get started. Okay. In terms of the ability of federal land agencies to authorize and restrict mining activities on federal public lands, how does the General Mining Law of 1872 differ from the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920? So the General Mining Law of 1872, one of the big things about that law is that prospectors have the right, they have the right to mine on non-withdrawn federal lands that haven't been reacquired. So it's a lot of BLM land and Forest Service land here in the West. There's a note in the book that like Eastern Forest Service lands they're reacquired. So that was land that was disposed, but then the federal government reattained it, you know, purchased it or reacquired it somehow. And those lands, the GML doesn't. I'm gonna probably use GML as a short for general mining law from here on out. But the GML doesn't allow, it doesn't apply to those lands. I think those lands will fall under the same category as like the Mineral Leasing Act, or they might have their own act, but it's not free for all. It's not, they don't have the right to mine on those lands. That's provided in the general mining law. And I guess essentially, there's a clause in the GML that states any citizen of domestic corporation to enter the public lands for the purpose of prospecting minerals. So yeah, no permit or anything required. They can just go out onto the Forest Service land and prospect. No permit, no license required. The miner, and then once they have established they found a marketable deposit or a prudent man, I guess. We'll get into those later. They find a deposit that has value, and they decide they're going to make a claim on it. Once they make that claim, they got to stake it out. They got to fall within the local jurisdictions, stake it out, and then I believe they got to report it to local authority, county, and then they report it to the surface agency, which is I guess would either be the BLM or the Forest Service. And then essentially after that, to hold that claim, all they have to do is I think it's $100 worth of work per year. So that's pretty minimal, to show that they've done that. And that's pretty much it. And that's just a claim. They just have right to the minerals on that section of land. They don't own the surface rights to that land. They just kind of have the exclusive mineral rights to their claim, the area that they've claimed. But I guess kind of in coordination with that, we do have so that would be an unpatented. I'm having trouble with that claim. In that case, so they don't have the surface rights to the land. They just have the exclusive mineral rights to that claim. But prior to 1995, claims could be patented. After say you find your claim, you work it, you maintain it for 5 years, doing that minimum $100 worth of work per year. And I think there also are some fees too in there as well, when you to submit an application for a claim. I think I'd have to double check on that. But anyway, after 5 years though, you could apply for a patent to own that land outright, privately own that land. And another note with the unpatented claims is that they can only be used for mining. You can't be doing other stuff on the surface not related to mining. It has to be related to mining. All activities on the claim have to be related to mining. But say with the patented claim, if your claim patent is accepted, your patent for the claim is accepted, so that land becomes yours. You have the surface right to that land. You're free to do whatever. It's private land at that point. It's it's your section, your little chunk of private land. So and it was also it was very cheap to do this. It was still based off the 1872 land prices. So there's two type of claims. We didn't go into this in class. It wasn't a huge focus. There's two different types of claims. I think there's a placer claim and then a load claim. And I don't know. Like I said, we didn't really go into the difference between the two. It's not super relevant to what we were kind of covering in class. But essentially, you would pay $250 an acre. I think it's for I can't remember. I got it later here in the thing as well. But yeah, so the claims, they're very cheap, either $2.50 per acre or $5 per acre, which is way below current day land values. And like I said, they've had a moratorium on the patenting claims since 1995. So each year they continually prevent it from happening. And I think they still have been processing claims that are patent claims that have been made prior to 1995. So there is still patent claims being processed and given out that were made prior to the 1995 moratorium. I feel like I've kind of gone off topic here a little bit, but okay, so we're still kind of on the GML. Yeah, so this applies, like I said, the GML only applies to public domain lands, lands that have been held by the federal government since they became a part of the U.S. Essentially, not permitted on acquired lands, like I mentioned with the eastern U.S. national forests, which were maybe at one time in private ownership or state ownership, but then have since returned to the federal government, been bought back or reacquired in some way. And then, yeah, there also are withdrawn lands, which the GML does not apply to as well. And these can be lands can be withdrawn from mining, via the executive or legislative Congress. And like a couple examples, like the Secretary of Interior via Section 204 of FLIPMA is legally, is entitled to withdraw lands from mining. However, there's limitations with that. Like if it's greater than 5,000 acres, it's a 20-year removal limit, and then they have to be, that withdrawal has to be renewed. And then if it's, I think, less than 5,000 acres, it's as long as, like, the Secretary of Interior can withdraw it for as long as those, for the desirable resource use, I guess. And then there's also an emergency withdrawal that the Secretary of Interior can do, which is limited to 3 years. And then the president also, like underneath the executive withdrawals, the president can also withdraw lands through the Antiquities Act of 1906. And then there's congressional statute, which so Congress can withdraw lands from mining. So I guess this would be like the Wilderness Act of 1964. They might have specifically identified lands to be withdrawn as wilderness in that act, and therefore those lands are withdrawn. However, with a lot of those congressional withdrawals, it seemed, I know in the reading, I think it was especially, like with the Wilderness Act, we'll just keep rolling with that example. National parks, I think, are they'd be congressional withdrawal as well. But there was, like, if there was a mining claim on that land prior to the congressional withdrawal, or prior to that land being designated as a wilderness, that mining claim can continue as it was before the congressional withdrawal took place. So they can't expand, but they can continue their operation as it was. That's kind of my understanding. I might have to go back on that and iron that out, smooth that out. But that is something to be noted, is that, like, even with those congressional withdrawals, if there were mining claims on them prior to that land being withdrawn, they can continue operations. I think that even goes for the national parks. And then, like, I know the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, that was kind of a big, like, there was some details in that one where it's like, because there's different designations of the rivers, like wild rivers that are designated wild, or maybe they're scenic. I can't remember, and I'm getting off topic. But yeah, so the congressional statute, there's withdrawn lands essentially that the GML doesn't apply to. And then kind of moving on to the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920. So there's no right to mine with the Mineral Leasing Act. In the Mineral Leasing Act, so the General Mining Law covers locatable minerals. And at one point, when the General Mining Act of 1872 had been passed, it was everything I think under the sun that could be mined kind of fell under it. And then over time, the government started pulling some stuff out. Like the Mineral Leasing Act, I think it really applies to oil and gas. That's where it came in big. That's what it's for, and it's so it doesn't offer that, there's not that right to go and prospect to mine for oil and drill and oil for gas on federal lands. The government has kind of it gives the government some discretionary power to permit prospecting for development of minerals covered in act and oil and gas in return for payment of certain fees. The leasing process, so it's lease based, so instead of going out and making your claim, the government will sell leases to land or auction off leases of land in a competitive market. So they'll give competitive leases, and the leases the competitive market that the leases are dispersed through kind of allows a more fair market value to be obtained for the lease. And the government still retain ownership of the federal lands that are leased for mineral rights. So the mineral rights are what are being leased out to these, oil companies or whoever's going to be drilling. And so the agencies can make lands open or closed for development depending on the land use plan. So definitely with the Mineral Leasing Act, there's a lot more discretion to the agency and control given to the agency. Yeah, and it's I'm getting kind of wordy with this, but yeah, so it's definitely because yeah, you gotta you can't just go out and prospect and stuff. You have to obtain a lease in order to do that, and then once and then also once you have that lease and you're drilling oil, then you also have to pay royalties and rental fees. So you're paying royalties on that on the sale of your oil and gas, as well as you're paying rental fees for the land. And I think there's also bonding requirements too as well to be paid for with the leasing. I don't got it on here, but it's a lot more like there's a lot more regulations, and then there's a lot that money they're getting a lot of money back. The federal government's getting way more money back with the leasing act than they would with the general mining law. And it also just a big difference is what they cover. The locatable minerals that are covered in the general mining law, such as gold and silver, copper, those minerals versus the Mineral Leasing Act, which covers oil and gas and stuff like that. Describe one common explanation as to why the general mining law of 1872 has been so resistant to change over the years. Are you in favor of modernizing this law? If so, explain how you would do so exactly, making explicit reference to parts of the 1872 law that you want to change. If not, explain why, making explicit reference to parts of the 1872 law that you want to remain the same. So I guess one of the big common explanations as to why this law has been resistant to change, especially I think we covered this in lecture pretty hard, but also in the book it's mentioned as well. But it kind of focuses on the public choice theory, or special interest groups, agency capture, which are kind of definitely three different things I just kind of put into one. But yeah, so you got these concentrated interests, which are mining companies, which they favor the subsidies in the GML favor them. They don't have to pay royalties on any of the minerals they're mining. They're free to go prospect. It's very, very loose, and so they're pretty free to do what they need. And it like I said, it offers a lot of subsidies and can be very profitable for them with the old GML. So these mining companies use this, use influence. Maybe they provide campaign donations, vocal support, gifts, anything to sway the vote, or direction a member of Congress may lean towards when considering reform or not. So it's I don't know. I guess one thing that helped me kind of understand this was I was watching some YouTube videos on it, and the military industrial complex. Mr. Beat does a pretty good video on that, explaining how that works, and it's very similar to that. It's the mining companies provide campaign donations or vocal support for a certain congressional member. That congressional member can vote and in favor, not in favor of reform, and they're gonna lean towards not reforming if they're getting these big campaign donations, gifts, or just even support or law. They're being lobbied heavily by these concentrated interests of the mining companies, whereas you may have these more diffuse, widespread public interest where there's maybe more people, but it's not as concentrated and not as well funded, that that are in favor of that are in favor of regulation, of regulating, changing the general mining law. So and they agency capture is kind of falls into that as well, where you maybe have a mining industry working in an area for a long time, and they build up over time, they develop a very close relationship with members of a federal agency in that area as well. And so I guess this really wouldn't have I don't know if agency capture would have as much to do with the not change the GML staying the same. I think it would have more to do with that special interest groups and public choice theory, those members of Congress acting in the best interest more of themselves, through those campaign donations, or, just, close, getting some sort of benefit from getting more benefit from helping the mining companies than they would from maybe the larger, diffuse, interest of the general public. Why is it doing that now? There you go. Okay, but okay, yeah, you can see how maybe this logo is starting to tie in a little bit. You know, you got a miner on there down at the bottom. And yeah, this was the the Bureau of Land Management's logo from when they formed from the, I think it was the merger of the General Land Office and shoot, I can't remember what the other one, like the grazing off. I'd have to double check, but in either way, yeah, the Bureau of Land Management. It was two other agencies that were formed together in 1946. Okay, so moving on, are you in favor of modernizing this law? Uh, yeah, I know. I definitely there. I think there are some things that can be improved in the general mining law. It has been around since 1872, so there's things have changed a little bit. I mean, to say the least, and I think most people would agree that there's definitely some room for improvement. Uh, I guess like one thing, there's this the prudent man doctrine in the general mining law, and it kind of ties in with the first answer where so okay, you go out, you prospect, and then you find you find something. In order to make a claim on it, they have this prudent man doctrine, which essentially is like, would a prudent man mine this, or is there enough there that a prudent man would spend time and money to mine this mineral? Like, would this would the amount of mineral there be enough to for a prudent man to mine it? I guess I don't know. I didn't explain that super well, but it's kind of subjective because it's like, well, if there's a dude with a shovel, pretty much any amount of mineral, a very small operation, any amount of mineral is gonna seem prudent for him to mine. And then there's like they did add like the marketability doctrine, which they still have the prudent man, but then they've added this marketability doctrine, which essentially is like, is the amount of mineral there, like, can they make profit? Is there enough there to make profit? Given the current economic conditions, and it seems a lot more objective. Like, I don't know, it just seems reasonable. Whereas the prudent man, it seems like it seems subjective, and like I said, someone like, I don't know, it could be like, yeah, I was out there with a shovel and my pan, and I found a couple flakes, but that it seemed prudent to me to mine, to stake a claim. Like, so I don't know. I don't. Maybe I didn't explain that way. Maybe I don't understand the prudent man, but I think that, like I said, I just think it's kind of pretty subjective and can be. I feel like it could be taken advantage of pretty easily. I think. Oh, and then another one. I think that it'd probably make sense just to kind of convert to the lease system that the Mineral Leasing Act's already under. Yeah, I don't know. You're getting. It's a competitive market. You're leasing these areas out to be mined. I mean, I think, yeah, it's, I don't know, I don't know, I think, yeah, it's just, yeah, if the mineral deposit is markable, I think I kind of have it where it's like, maybe, okay, so maybe it wouldn't be a competitive lease system, like, they'd still have that right to mine, to go out and prospect, but say you went out prospecting and you find a deposit that's marketable. Then you could apply for a lease of your claim. Maybe you stake out your claim and then you apply for a lease of it. So I think that's kind of where I was going with it. So I was a bit off when I just was spitballing earlier there. And so the surface agency would still retain would have given discretion to deny a lease to an applicant, and these leases would have fixed duration, and then there would be like a renewal process where maybe they'd have to like provide like the marketability is still there for that lease to be retained, instead of just like that marginal $100 worth of work per year to retain a mining claim. There's no royalties in the general mining law, so I think we kind of adapt that as well from the mineral leasing system. Adapt these royalties so that that they were getting some money back. And there, I did read like, because there are like, that was also like one of the things like, because so like there was I know Australia does this, but they use these ad valorem royalties, which are assessed on the sale of the mineral and are subject to changes in price. So it's not like they're just getting a cut rate off the top, regardless of the price of the minerals. So when the price of the minerals go down, the lease, the royalty fees go down as well. And then I did also see where Australia, like that the royalty changes based on like how far down the level of production that company takes the mineral to. Like, say the company's just mining the ore and then selling it directly after, it's a higher royalty. Whereas if the company's mining the ore and then processing it to like, to refining it, processing it, and getting it to like, I don't know, ingot status, I don't know. But anyway, like if the more that that company processes the ore before they sell it, the less the royalty would be, which makes sense. They're putting more money into it. But yeah, so I think implementing some sort of royalty into the mining, a mining law, because it is, they're profiting off, I guess, what would be the general public. The public owns those. It's the public land, federal public lands. Everyone owns them here in the U.S. So they're getting profit from everyone's minerals. And granted, yeah, they're the ones out there doing the work and mining it, but they're still, everyone owns those, so everyone should be theoretically maybe getting a little bit of a cut, and that's what those royalties would do. And then also, like, I know with the Mineral Leasing Act, those royalties also go back to like reclamation funds and like local communities, counties, county governments, and stuff like that. So it disperses that money back to the community, or back into it disperses that money and provides it for services. Let's see. Oh yeah, like I also have a reclamation bond here as well, and I think agencies do have these in place now. I don't know. I was getting a little bit confused there, but yeah. But anyways, yeah. Before like kind of tying in with the lease, before like a lease can be granted, the applicant must post a bond of reclamation, and that essentially is like putting up money that ensures that the site is going to be restored and post mining, that once the mining operation is done. And then a plan of operations required after the lease is granted, and it must comply with NEPA and conducting a full EIS for that mining operation. So definitely getting more environmental regulation involved as well, and foresight into potential side effects of the mine. So getting NEPA involved, on that plan of operations level. And it could be maybe they have to, before they can start mining, this plan of operations has to be approved by the surface agency, and then the operations can be in. And I think there are like these things, like some of these are implemented, and by further regulation as well. In terms of royalties, revenue returned to the federal government, how does the Mineral Leasing Act differ from the General Mining Law of 1872? So yeah, like I kind of hit this already a bit, but the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 essentially, requires royalties to be paid by the leaseholder to the federal government, and it's they're based on the market value of the mineral or price received for its sale. Pretty basic. The federal government's getting money back. They're charging. They're getting a percentage of that profits from the sale of those minerals. And like I mentioned, those royalties are being fed back into reclamation funds, city, local governments, county governments, state governments, etc. It's being shared. And then like I've mentioned, the GML, there's no royalty requirements on the profits. No money paid to the government for taking and selling minerals on federal lands. Yeah, so pretty straightforward there. What is an inholding found on public land, and what do they have to do with the old patent provision that used to be a part of the 1872 mining law? So I kind of covered this one a little bit earlier too, but essentially, inholdings are these tracts of patented private land that are held within larger areas of federal public land. So maybe you got like a national forest, and then in the middle of it you got this really small, weird-shaped little chunk of private. And essentially, their association with the GML, it's kind of going back to that patent claim system, which I had mentioned earlier. There's been a moratorium on since 1995, so these are no longer being, it's no longer, I guess, new ones aren't no longer being established. But it's, claims could be patented after 5 years. So, essentially, I guess $500 worth of work's done on that land, you can patent the claim. And essentially, it's, $2.50 per acre or $5 per acre, depending on the type of claim. So, load or a placer or a load, I believe. And so, the claimant becomes the private property owner of the land. They're free to do as they please, as they please, and no longer, the activities on that chunk of land no longer have to be mining related. They can do whatever they want. It's private land. It's theirs. Moving on. Could a state government impose some type of reasonable regulation on a developer of a proposed mine under the 1872 General Mining Law? Would such regulation be automatically preempted under the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution? Please explain with an example. All right, so this one definitely took me a little bit to work through, but essentially, so the GML, there's a clause in there that says, so long as they comply with the laws of the United States, with state, territorial, and local regulations. So that's kind of a big clause because it does say, like, the GML is in effect as long as they comply with the laws of, and like in the case of this question, like with the laws of the state or local regulations as well. So there was a case we covered in class, the People versus Reinhardt. So in 2009, California placed a moratorium on gold dredging in waterways, which was a statewide moratorium. So in 2012, Reinhardt, this dude, he's charged for having and operating a dredge on federal land. So yeah, so he's charged with this charged by this state regulation, but he was mining on federal land, or he was using the dredge on federal lands. So Reinhardt objected the charges and challenged that the GML preempts the California state moratorium on dredging. He thinks he uses the GML to challenge that. So the California Supreme Court, it goes to the California Supreme Court, and they determined that the Mining Act did not regulate mining methods, but it did, it regulates the allocation of claims, unlike the moratorium, which regulates the use of specific equipment. So that's kind of where, yeah. So the California regulation only prohibits the use of dredges for mining in rivers and streams, and does not prohibit other types of mining and locations. But the GML would preempt the state regulation if the state regulations outright banned mining statewide, federal, state lands, unpatented claims. But since the California regulation only prohibits the use of dredges for mining in rivers and streams, and does not prohibit mining of other types of mining in locations, they state that then the GML does not preempt it. It would only preempt it if the state outright banned mining. The California Supreme Court, they cited that the GML still deferred to local and state law in its language with state, territorial, and local regulations, like I mentioned at the beginning of this question. And there's this Granite Rock precedent, which they kind of avoided because it would not serve to favor their position that the GML doesn't preempt it. But I think it essentially, like, the Granite Rock precedent essentially kind of created this commercial impracticability test. Man, I am struggling today. But anyways, so where it was like the commercial impracticability test essentially was like, if state regulation makes mining economically unfeasible, then it equivalates, then it's considered an effective ban on mining, and then the GML would preempt the state regulation. So the California Supreme Court determined that the moratorium on dredging was not severe enough to the point that all mining on federal lands in California would be impractical or economically unfeasible, and then so therefore the GML doesn't preempt it. And then it did also get into the fact of the moratorium on dredging is not severe enough to the point all mining on federal lands would be impractical. If I think it would also be considered a land use plan then as well. If it made mining on all federal lands impractical, then it would be considered a land use plan. And if it was considered if it was determined that moratorium was like a land use plan, then the state regulation would be preempted as well, because state land use planning is preempted or can be preempted by FLPMA and NIFMA on federal lands. So if that, I know in the case even in Reinhardt versus, is it just Reinhardt? The People versus Reinhardt, I guess it'd be California versus Reinhardt maybe. But anyway, if it was considered a state land use plan, then it would be preempted on federal lands by NIFMA and FLPMA. But like they said in the case, there's a really gray line between those, like a land use plan and a regulation. But since this was considered, I think if it had been considered a complete ban on mining, then it really would be a land use plan. Either way, So yeah, the GML does not automatically preempt a reasonable regulation placed on a mining claim. It would, yeah, it would preempt regulations that would completely prohibit mining by making it economically unfeasible. And I guess even like with the NIFMA and FLIPMA, like the land use plan thing, that really doesn't even apply to this question, because this is just asking if the GML would automatically preempt via the supremacy clause any state regulation on mining, and it doesn't, at least in this case. And I know I was reading that apparently there was they applied for writ of cert to go to the Supreme Court with this, and I think it was denied actually, but I don't know. I think this is something that, like I said, there was a pretty good gray line with the land use planning aspect of it. But yeah, essentially, yeah, I think the argument more is that GML isn't like it's not regulatory, or it's not really for regulation. It's more for like land or claim. What's the language there? Yeah, okay, GML. Hey, where is this? What did I? Okay. Oh, I guess I didn't even mention too about the California Supreme Court also did cite the Woodruff case and the California ban on hydraulic mining, which was very similar to this, but the case cited, the GML. The state regulation wasn't preempted by the GML in that case either. I need some water. Okay. I think I gotta pick up the pace a little bit. Very basically, what are two ways that federal lands could be withdrawn from mineral entry under the 1872 General Mining Law? Okay, we covered this one a bit already, but anyway, there's, you can do it through legislative or the executive. Legislatively, it's lands that are withdrawn by, from entry of mining by a congressional statute, wilderness areas, like the Wilderness Act of 1964. Congress designated wilderness areas within national forests that could be closed to entry. And then you got like Mining in the Parks Act of 1976, closed parks and monuments that had been previously open to location under the GML. And then like also the Wild Scenic, and there's plenty, there's a bunch of acts, but like Wild and Scenic Rivers, I'm just listing off a few here. Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968, public lands within wild river boundaries are closed to mineral entry. Just to name a few. And then, then there's through the executive, and like I mentioned with the president, the executive order via the Antiquities Act of 1906. And then there's also the Secretary of Interior has that power under the FLIPMA, Section 204 regulations. But these are also, he's limited in what he can do or how long he can withdraw these lands, with the given size and emergency or anything like that. With sufficient detail, describe two widespread and often repeated criticisms of the General Mining Law of 1872. So I guess one would be like the lack of royalties. So like I mentioned in the Leasing Act of 1920, royalties are charged on profits from minerals mined, and revenue is shared with the state and put towards land reclamation funds. The GML doesn't require royalties to be paid on minerals sold. By not charging royalties on profits made from the harvest of public minerals, the government is subsidizing. It acts as a subsidy to the mining industry. The public technically owns the minerals being mined. They should be getting a cutout profit. Is kind of a wide view shared of that. The argument I guess is just to be charge royalties like the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 and use the revenue for reclamation and return the money to the public who own the minerals being mined. And then there's also I got another one here, which would be the claim patent land prices, which I don't know if this is a good one to put on here since it's been, like I said, banned since 1995. But essentially, I guess that means they kind of addressed it. But yeah, I guess the prices that are charged for those claim patents is definitely a pretty good complaint or a criticism. The General Mining Act, after a claim is maintained for 5 years, $500 worth of work done can be patented for $2.50 per acre if it's a placer claim, or $5 per acre if it's a load claim. And then, there's also, there was also like an extension in there too, where like you could also claim an additional piece of land adjacent to your mining claim in order to put a mill, like for other purposes related to mining, and you would just pay the load claim fee in order to patent that land as well. I don't know. Not that it's super necessary, but I don't know. I like to look at it. Is this still going? Okay. Okay, yeah, miner could also patent up, yeah, like I said, 5 acres of adjacent lands for, that, the mills or whatever, mining related uses, and, yeah. So it's not directly mining, but it is related to the mine. Yeah, annual moratorium, though, in 1995. The prices are still based off land prices of 1872, so the argument would be if they're gonna keep this, if they were to keep this, it would definitely be to make those prices reflective of today's land prices, which would be quite a bit more, yeah. And then I guess even a larger argument or a bigger argument would just be complete termination of the patent. This is still in. The claim patent thing is still in the law. It's not like say they, I don't know how the moratorium exactly works. If it's just voted on every year to continue it to re-up it for another year, but say like 1 year there's like maybe there were some people in there who, it went the other way and they didn't. And yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look into that a little more. But yeah, these claim patents also, they lead to the private in-holdings within these federal public lands that impose management challenges to federal agencies. Going back to way back to exam 1, the checkerboard pattern. Yeah, I guess you could even say these in-holdings from mining claims would contribute to that a little bit as well. With sufficient detail, describe two arguments that are made. Oh wow, I misread this one the first time through. I'm going to come back and fix my answer. Yeah. Shoot. Okay. Yeah, my answer's way off on this one. I misread this. So I'm going to have to fix that. I'm just going to skip it for now. Dang it. Okay. Can the U.S. Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management regulate mining on the federal lands if it manages? If so, or I'll see as in there, please choose one agency. If so, what specific law and or regulation could it use to do so? Please choose one law specific to the U.S. Forest Service or BLM or both. Can the U.S. Forest Service or BLM categorically say no to a proposed hard rock mine to be located on lands not withdrawn from mineral entry? Why is this a tricky question? So my answer here, I went with the BLM. So in FLIPMA, there's a provision that that states, in managing the public lands, the Secretary shall, by regulation or otherwise, take any action necessary to prevent unnecessary or undue degradation. So this line kind of gives them a hook to implement some regulation of mining, and so from this they implement the 3809 rules, which are regulations put forth by the BLM to prevent unnecessary or undue degradation. And I think you could even I guess it would be in the CFR, but I've seen this thing where it says it's for people on these who with the mining claims and it's like, how do I prevent unnecessary or undue degradation, and then it cites 3809 rules. But so there's these regulations put forth, they require a notice of operations to the agency before you begin, and then they require a plan of operations for non-casual mining operations. And I think casual versus non-casual, I believe it's size of the mine. I'd have to double check on that. But so for these plans of operation, it includes reclamation planning. The operator must provide a financial guarantee based on estimate of what it would cost for the BLM to hire a third party to reclaim the operation. So there's that reclamation bond, I guess, that I had kind of mentioned earlier. So they do have that here in the 3809 rules to ensure some sort of reclamation is considered. The plan of operations also undergoes a NEPA analysis, consulted with other acts such as the ESA or the EPA. Not ESA, or some of the other various acts too, environmental acts. performance standards are also required in the plan of operations to prevent, performance standards required in the plan of operations to prevent unnecessary undue degradation, and that's, those are found in, CFR 3809, Section 420. I think that's what I saw when I was reading the, how do I prevent unnecessary and undue degradation. And the operations cannot begin until the plan is approved. The BLM, they cannot outright say no to someone, to mining and prevent a person from exploring and mining the federal public domain on withdrawn lands. However, the BLM can deny plans of operation that are not compliant with 3809 rules that prevent unnecessary. So they can, they can't say no, but they could deny, a plan of operations, and they could keep doing so until those, I guess, the 3809 rules are satisfied. So there's definitely, they could, but then that and then that could open the door for litigation too, though, if they're kicking a plan down the road for a extended period of time. All right. What is meant by the term agency capture? So it's agency capture is essentially like agencies work in a narrower field than the legislator. So there's a kind of a concentration in influences. The concentration and influence of special interests can be greater. So like for, just a couple of examples, like timber companies with the Forest Service, or mining companies with the BLM, or grazing, ranchers and grazing with the BLM. That's like, there's a tighter focus. It's not, they're not working with a very broad field. Anyways, these special interests focus time and energy on the regulatory process. They have influence over the agency, and over time, the agency eventually kind of starts to align with the group, with the special interest group, the timber company, the mining company, ranchers. And so, the industry, subject to the agency regulations, over time influences the people who are, that influence extends to those people in the agency that are supposed to supervise and enforce those regulations. They might start overlooking stuff and letting stuff, fly under the radar. And like even the book mentions that over time, maybe that people from that company, or that company gets people in the agency who are very, maybe, just very tied to the company. And essentially, once it's like industries getting considerable influence in these concentrated fields over an agency, and eventually using that to work with them and bypass regulations, or have stuff overlooked. And I'm trying to think of the example, but I think I got an example here in the next one. Okay. What is meant by the term agency capture? Please explain the term by making reference to either mining, mineral leasing, or rangeland law and management. How can citizen suits and or judicial review provisions provide a check and balance on captured agencies? So like I said, so I go on this one, I kind of go with agency capture, rangeland law and management. So I go with the rangeland. And in FLIPMA section 309, there's a provision about advisory councils, which the Secretary of Interior puts in place. It's essentially a group of 10 to 15 local citizens appointed by the Secretary. These guys represent citizens in the area of the land use planning, that the land use planning affects. And the Advisory Council may furnish advice for the Secretary, or to the Secretary, with respect to the land use planning, classification, retention, management, and disposal of the public lands within the area. So this Advisory Council, they work, they communicate pretty closely with the Secretary, or the BLM group, BLM office in that area. The Advisory Council, a statutory form, this is in the statute of NIFMA, as a concentrated interest, it's locals, they probably, in some cases it might be, grazing, it might be a, an area where ranching and grazing is really big, so they're gonna, they might, that's gonna be their focus, is to maintain that. And so, they might, may have a certain agenda, such as grazing for the public federal lands of the area, and a more direct relationship with those BML, concentrated in direct relationship with those BLM personnel. While the broader public, they're a more diffuse interest, may have a more multiple use agenda, that they prefer for those public lands. But anyway, the Advisory Council will push this grazing, they could push that grazing agenda and maybe limiting regulations towards towards grazing, or pushing regulations towards the other multiple use, preventing the other multiple use activities on that land. And then over time, and under the influence of the advisory council, the BLM and its employees in the area might be would become captured, essentially, and they make favorable decisions towards the preferred grazing, the ranchers and preferred use of grazing. And this could be just done through maybe overlooking violations of regulations, or ignoring rules, or and even maybe going so far as to block other interests from getting into there. Yeah. And let's see, what do I got here? Oh, okay. Moving on to the second part. So, how can citizen suits and/or judicial review provisions provide a check and balance on captured agencies? So for this, I kind of went to the case. There was a case in the book, Sierra Club versus Hardin. Timber sale in the Tongass National Forest, and essentially it's based that Tongass National Forest was kind of captured by these timber companies, and it was like huge percentage of the forest that they were going to be selling in this sale, and it provides this kind of this APA judicial review clause where a person suffering legal wrong because of agency action or adversely affected or aggrieved by agency action within the meaning of relevant statute is entitled to judicial review thereof. So essentially, in the Sierra Club versus Hardin, the court held that one seeking standard under this provision must meet two tests. He must show that the challenged action has caused injury in fact, economic, or otherwise, and that the interest sought to be protected must be arguably within the zone of interest protected or regulated by a statute or constitutional guarantee. So, and then they further go on to say, it is generally recognized that the type of injury which will support standing to sue in the public interest need not be economic, but may be aesthetic, conservational, or recreational. So they state that so that kind of meets the first, that by stating that they state that the people have standing if it even if that the injury doesn't just have to be economic, it can also be aesthetic, conservational, or recreational. So that by that they kind of meet the first provision to meet standing under the judicial review, person suffering legal wrong. And then under the circumstances of this case, Sierra Club and the Sitka Conservation Society have standing to assert the aesthetic and conservational and recreational interests of local members. So that kind of meets the second provision to meet standing under the judicial review. Interests of local members and users who are directly affected by the timber sale and proposed pulp mill complex. So essentially, it essentially gives it, I think it's especially like that first, the injury. He must show that the challenged action has caused injury in fact, economic, or otherwise, and is generally recognized that the type of injury which will support standing to sue in the public interest need not be economic, but may be aesthetic, conservational, or recreational. So that gives them, that's a pretty big part of getting standing to sue, or to litigate, or to, judicial review. To litigate under judicial review. And then, of course, there's the second part, too, which the interest sought must be protected, or to be protected must be arguably within the zone of interest protected. So, they got members that are going to be, there's people and local members and users who are directly affected by the timber sale. And there was also a proposed mill complex as well. So this is how they kind of challenge that agency capture. It's a bit, I don't know if I quite got that, but it's, because it was like tough understanding, and I had to read through this quite a bit to get to that point. What does it mean when someone says that a hard rock mining claim or federal lands grazing permit or timber sale is a subsidy? So these are referred to subsidies because the cost to mine or graze on federal public lands is comparably cheaper than it would be on private land. And then here I got from a CRS report. So the BLM and Forest Service grazing fees, the minimum is $1.35 per animal unit month, and the highest that it's ever been is $2.31 per AUM. And then they cite that state land grazing fees range typically from $1.35 per AUM to $80 per AUM, and private lands grazing fees range from $8 per AUM to $23 per AUM. So yeah, obviously you can tell like just by listing off those different grazing fees, the BLM Forest Service grazing fee is far below the private or state grazing fees. And so essentially by offering these cheaper options to graze cattle, and then like even with the mines, there's not, at those federal, the GML, it's pretty loose, no royalties or anything like that, at least for the locatable minerals. So it's also, I mean, that acts as a subsidy as well. But yeah, by offering these cheaper options to graze cattle or mine, even the federal government is incentivizing mining or grazing and mining on the federal public lands and subsidizing it. What is a grazing fee on federal lands, and why is there so much controversy about the issue? So grazing fees, they were established under the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, kind of in response to the deteriorating conditions of the American West and the Dust Bowl and rangelands. But essentially, I think in the act, it's stated as a reasonable fee, charged to cover the cost of administering the range. And it's a price paid by the leaseholder, charged per animal unit month (AUM). And AUM, it's animal unit month, so it's the amount of forage that an animal unit, 1,000 pounds of grazing animals is going to need, or one cow-calf pair would be one animal unit, is going to need to sustain per month. And so it's not a unit of area, it's a unit of biomass, essentially. And I think, so I guess for a cow-calf pair example, it'd be 700, I think it's 1,000, this is my intro to rangeland management, so it's definitely probably not exact, but I think for a cow-calf pair or one animal unit, and if it's a ruminant, which needs 2.5%, 2.5% of its body mass per day, 1,000 times, or 2.5% of 1,000, was that 25 pounds per, no, 2.5, is it 25 pounds per day? That seems like a lot. I don't know. Shoot. Now I'm second guessing myself. But I think the AUM is 750 pounds of biomass per month. Is one AUM for a one animal unit of ruminants at least that need 2.5% body mass per day. I guess I would be 1,000 times. I think 2.5% of 1,000 would be 25. Yeah. Okay. So yes, 25 pounds per day times 30 days in a month, 750 pounds of biomass is one animal unit month. Not that has nothing to do with this. I'm just going off on a tangent there. Anyway, so yeah, and anyways, these animal unit month or the fees are calculated. The PREA Act 1978 essentially created this equation on which these fees would be calculated, and they're adjusted by. The formula is the fees are adjusted by current private grazing lease value, cattle prices, and the cost of production of cattle. So they change with time based on the other factors I just listed. And the BLM and Forest Service charge the same fees for grazing on their lands, for their leases. So the controversy kind of arises because, one in the last question, grazing fees are often viewed as a subsidy to the ranchers, to the grazers. And then also fees have been historically lower and are currently much lower, than in the cost to lease private or state lands for grazing. And this is also to be mentioned with the caveat that federal lands are generally poorer quality. So a part of it is you're paying for what you're getting. I mean, yeah, and it's not you put cattle on public land. There's other people that are going to be recreating. Can be out there too. So it's. I don't know, you're sharing that land a bit. It's not just going to be your cattle out there. And I guess, so I think there should be some, that should be noted. They're paying pretty cheap, cheaper than average for these lands, but they're also contending with other stuff as well. And I think they're also, poorer quality, probably don't have as good, water, sources or anything like that either. But then also, I think kind of the big one, that's covered is that, BLM and Forest Service, they usually spend way more maintaining these rangelands than they get back in the fees from their leases. So here, I think from that same CRS document I referenced earlier, in 2017, the BLM appropriated $79 million to rangeland management, and they collected $18.3 million in grazing fees. So that's a pretty big disparity, I guess, there. And I think, granted, I think this would be like, I don't know if misleading is the right word, because I think, like, well, obviously that would apply to like BLM wide, but I'm sure there's like certain areas where they're probably like making money, or at least breaking even. You know, if you looked at like more focused sites, like I'm thinking of like if you went to the Glasgow field office, and I don't know, I guess, or maybe just like the resource management plan, like I said, I think, yeah, looking at maybe more in depth there, or closer in areas, it might be a little less like of a shocking figure disparity. I don't know. And I guess they're also like, I don't know, that money is being appropriated to rangeland management. That doesn't necessarily, like, rangeland management is like they're they're managing that land for more than just grazing too, though. You know, they're managing it, for other uses. So I guess, I don't know, the fact that they're maybe not making all that back on grazing fees. So I don't know. I think that fact there is a little bit, I don't know if misleading. Like I said, I don't know if misleading is the right word, but it's a little weird. What is a grazing fee on federal lands, and why is there so much controversy about this issue? What guidance do federal range laws provide regarding grazing fees on BLM lands? Be sure to include relevant provisions from the from FLPMA and Public Rangelands Improvement Act, PREA. So, okay. Yeah. I guess I kind of covered what grazing fees are in the last one. What do I got going on here? I got like multiples of the same question back to back to back. But anyway, yeah. So, they're referred to by. I don't know if I answered this all the way, actually. I gotta. What the heck's going on here? Okay, I did some weird copy and pasting here. But anyway, okay, grazing fees established under the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. Reasonable fee at the time, in the Grazing Act, Taylor Act, at least, they're stated to be a reasonable fee charged to cover the cost of administering the range. It's a price paid by the landholder, charged per animal unit month. Calculated by, they changed, the amount, it just didn't go from a reasonable fee. There was an actual, calculation established by PREA to calculate, the grazing fees. Anyways, so controversy, they're referred to as subsidies. They generally don't cover the cost by a lot for managing rangelands, I guess. So, getting into FLPMA, the FLPMA in 76, there's some stuff in there. Yeah, so the guidance that it provides in reference to these grazing fees is that, the U.S. should receive a fair market value for the use of public lands. However, it did place a moratorium on fees until placed a moratorium on fee increases until the BLM and Forest Service could determine what fees were equitable to both the Treasury and those who held grazing permits. So that's kind of what FLPMA did. It stated that the U.S. should be receiving more more fair market value for the use of the public lands, and it placed a moratorium on fee increases until the BLM and Forest Service could determine what would be equitable. And then PREA in 1978's passed, and essentially in PREA, the Congress legislates a formula to calculate grazing fees, and so there's a base value of $1.23 per AUM, and then they adjust it based on private grazing lease rates, cattle prices, and the cost of production. So the legal minimum, the minimum that can be charged under PREA is $1.35 per AUM, and I think that's what it was. I don't know, in the reading, I don't know how recent it got to, but I think it's been pretty much right around that for a while. And I think the highest it's ever been was $2.31, and that was way back, I think, in 1981. So it's never gotten high, and yeah, it's definitely pretty low. Let's see. The Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 includes a provision stating that the Secretary of Interior shall manage public lands pending their final disposal. How did the Federal Land Policy Management Act, FLPMA, change this provision? So yeah, Taylor Grazing Act establishes grazing districts pending its final disposal. So this with this clause, it kind of leaves the door open that these grazing lands could be disposed someday. So, I think and I think we'll get into that with the next question, but essentially, these people, ranchers and stuff, they get these leases and stuff, and they're kind of holding on to them, and they're thinking, all right, hold on to this lease. I think one day this will probably could very well get transferred over to my hands, or even expect, this is going to get transferred over to my, to private eventually, and so eventually, a lot of people and states are expecting this land to be disposed of eventually, with that statement in Taylor Act. But then FLPMA in 1976 comes out, and essentially this just comes out right and declares the policy of the United States that the public lands be retained in federal ownership in Section 102. So the final disposal mentioned in the Taylor Grazing Act is now established as retention in the federal public domain by FLPMA. So kind of a deflator if you were holding out for that land to be disposed of. You had that lease for, I guess you'd been holding on to that lease for 42 years, and then, no. Kind of a bummer. I mean, a real bummer if you were expecting that. So, yeah, many people prior to the like I've just said, prior to the passage of FLPMA believed that these grazing districts would be leased, and leases within them established under the Taylor Grazing Act would be eventually disposed into private lands or turned over to the state. And then that slides directly into the next question. What is a common theme found in past or present versions of the Sagebrush Rebellion? How does a central tenet of this movement challenge the pervasive theme found in federal law that public lands be managed and conserved in the national interest? So a common theme of the Sagebrush Rebellions, and there's been like 3 phases of Sagebrush Rebellion. So there was like the original one, which occurred after FLPMA, and it was kind of in response to FLPMA, and then so like a bunch of those environmental acts in the early 70s, as well as the Kleppe versus New Mexico decision. And then there was one, I think, in the 90s, and that one, I can't remember exactly like what that was really in response to. And then there was one more recently in like the mid 2010s, and that I know that had a lot to do with the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, and again I think that was kind of in response. Actually, like I said, I'm not super versed on that. I'm gonna have to touch up on that stuff a bit. But yeah, anyways, a common theme above them, of those Sagebrush Rebellions was just like the loss of local control over federal public lands and the wanting of the transfer of federal lands to states and private disposal of the land. Going back to that, what I kind of discussed in the last one, how people had the expectation that these lands were going to be transferred or disposed of eventually, and then FLPMA flipped that one on its head. Pun. I'm just kidding. Anyway, FLPMA in 1976. Let's see how I'm answering this. Okay. All right. Anyway. So FLPMA in 1976 was a large contributor. It kind of helped ignite the original Sagebrush Rebellion, or was a big igniter of it. So Section 102 essentially states that public lands will be retained in federal ownership, and that here's the national. Okay, and the national interest will be best realized if the public lands and their resources are periodically and systematically inventoried, and their present and future use is projected through a land use planning process. So this essentially established that no more federal lands would be disposed to private and state hands, and then also recognizes that the national interest in these public lands, and that it will be considered that when determining what the land should be used. The national interest is going to be a larger part of that land use process. Land use planning process. So these, the Sagebrush rebels, they essentially want the federal lands transferred back to the state, or transferred to the state and private, or in favor of more localized, management of these lands. And I think, And this would lead to less concern for national interest, for the national interest and multiple use for these lands, and an increased, local local interest, that might be grazing or mining, instead of more of the multiple use recreational interest of the broader national interest. A lot of interest in that sentence. Describe the multiple use mandate as found in the Federal Land Policy Management Act of 1976. How much management discretion does it provide to the Bureau of Land Management? What do resource management plans, as required by FLPMA and NEPA, have to do with multiple use? Provide an example in your answer. So, FLPMA, Section 202, essentially states that the Secretary of Interior needs to use and observe the principles of multiple use and sustained yield in the development and revision of a use plan. So that's the multiple use mandate in FLPMA. So then FLPMA Section 103C defines multiple use as the management of public lands and their various resource values so that they are utilized in the combination that will best meet the present and future needs of the American people for renewable and non-renewable resources, including but not limited to recreation, range, timber, minerals, watershed, wildlife, fish, and natural, scenic, scientific, and historical values. It kind of offers a wide range of discretion to the BLM, depending on what angle you look at it when you look at that definition through that multiple use mandate through. And then so here you got the case here I kind of cited the case NRDC versus Hodel, which the court on FLPMA and PREA, they stated that their general causes and phrases, which can hardly, I guess this would be the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act they're referencing here, or Multiple Use Sustained Yield Clause. Their general clauses and phrases, which can hardly be considered concrete limits on agency discretion, and it breeds discretion at every pore, which is kind of the big line, hammering home the amount of discretion that these offer these agencies. And I got another case of the comb wash allotment case, where the BLM essentially they relied on a programmatic EIS conducted for the resource management plan of the San Juan resource area for authorization of the comb wash allotment. And the San Juan, the RMP and the EIS were at kind of the programmatic level. And so the case was that the comb wash allotment required more site-specific considerations, like EIS, before grazing could be allowed down there. And so the courts found that this was a violation of Section 302 of FLPMA by authorizing grazing without engaging in reasoned and informed decision making. No allotment management plan, no site-specific EIS, and did not show it balanced competing resource values. And then it also had violated Section 102 of NEPA as well when permitting grazing in the comb wash allotment. And Judge Rapton in this case states, the BLM had violated FLPMA by failing to make reasoned and informed decision that the benefits of grazing in the canyons outweighed the costs. So, yeah. Sierra Club versus Butts, multiple use principle requires that the values in question be informedly and rationally taken into balance. So I guess if the BLM had prepared a site-specific EIS and had shown that they had reasonably and informedly concluded that grazing in the comb wash was in the best interest by weighing against other interests, they could not have been in violation of FLPMA or NEPA. So it says, I don't know why I exactly went with that case in this one, because it didn't dissonate. I guess, yeah, it didn't really like discretion. I guess it essentially kind of just shows that if the agency had even just considered the other multiple uses, they would have had discretion to choose which was, what would be best going forward. They just didn't do that, apparently, by only using the RMP and the programmatic EIS for the area. And and then here, I even quoted another case, Sierra Club versus Butts, where multiple use principle essentially just requires that the values in question be informedly and rationally taken into balance. So I guess if the BLM in this case had shown that they had rationally and informedly taken into balance the grazing and the comb wash allotment with other uses, then they would have been in the clear to choose whatever at their discretion. And there's another case, I think I'll probably even talk about it later, that they do. I mean, the courts don't have, they defer to the discretion of the agency. Why is the multiple use mandate given to the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service considered so discretionary? Multiple use mandate, and this one I kind of go with FLIPMA, but they're both very similar for the two. I think, FLIPMA came out after the multiple use mandate of the Forest Service, and it's written a lot of the language is the same. But anyway, so yeah. Section 302 of FLIPMA, the Secretary shall manage public lands under the principles of multiple use and sustained yield in accordance with the land use plans developed by him under Section 202. So multiple use has a long and broad definition, and that's found in FLIPMA Section 103C. That can be interpreted, like I said, a long, broad definition that can be interpreted differently depending on from which angle you look at it, and what's included in the multiple, the definitions of multiple use changes depending on, shifting executives. And, so I guess, why do I go into this? Some of these I just totally don't know where I was going with. Because next thing I got is Section 302B, in managing the public lands, the Secretary shall, by regulation or otherwise, take any action necessary to prevent unnecessary or undue degradation of the lands. Depending on a view of the Secretary and administration in power, definition of what constitutes, I don't know why I would have that in here, because that's not really, I don't know if that has a huge to do with the, multiple use mandate, or definition. But yeah, essentially the multiple use mandate offers up a large list of potential land uses and then state that they must be balanced in the land management process. So, it offers up a lot, and there's the language in it's really ambiguous. I think as long as they do it in a reasoned and informed, reasoned, informed, rational method, then they have discretion. Okay. Oh boy. Multiple use according to the federal land policy, FLIPMA, is defined the following way: the management of the public lands and their various resources and their various resource values, that they are utilized in the combination that will best meet the present and future needs of the American people, making the most judicious use of the land for some or all of these resources or related services over areas large enough to provide sufficient latitude for periodic adjustments in use to conform to changing needs and conditions. The use of some land for less than all of the resources, a combination of balanced, diverse resource uses that takes into account the long-term needs of future generations for renewable and non-renewable resources, including but not limited to recreation, range, timber, minerals, watershed, wildlife and fish, and natural, scenic, scientific, and historical values, and harmonious and coordinated management of the various resources without permanent impairment of the productivity of the land and the quality of the environment, with consideration being given to the relative values of resources and not necessarily to the combination of uses that will give the greatest economic return or even the greatest unit output. So yeah, there's a lot of pretty discretionary language in there. Like I said, depending on how you look at that, or from what angle you want to look at that, you can definitely choose word quotes and sections that would favor your position. So the BLM's new FLIPMA regulations state that conservation is a use on par with other uses of the public lands under FLIPMA's multiple use and sustained yield framework. Do you believe that BLM's interpretation of multiple use in this proposed regulation is lawful, or does it exceed the agency's statutory authority under FLIPMA? In other words, does it go too far? Please explain, making a reference to agency discretion and the court's interpretation of multiple use. So yeah, anyways, BLM is using statutory authority from FLPMA to establish conservation as a use that is on par with other uses of the public lands under FLPMA's multiple use framework. So yeah, there's a case, it provides a case where states are currently litigating against the BLM for this, for putting conservation in there as a multiple use. And it, in the proposed regulation, conservation is defined as the management of natural resources to promote protection and restoration. The overarching purpose of the rule is to help facilitate the use of conservation to support ecosystem resilience, including a new tool in restoration and mitigation leases. To meet this objective. So I think that's kind of a big line, the restoration and mitigation leases. So I think that opens the door for people to essentially I think they could get a bid on a grazing permit or obtain a grazing permit and not have to use it for grazing. They could use it for restoration and mitigation, conservation, I guess. If conservation is found to be, if it's a multiple use, it fits under the multiple use objective. To meet this objective, conservation is a use and that protection and restoration are tools. Yeah, conservation is a use and that protection and restoration are tools to achieve conservation. So I believe that the BLM does have discretion under FLPMA to make this regulation. And I looked at the case Perkins versus Birkeland on this one, where the Forest Service was challenged as arbitrary and capricious in reducing stocking rates of grazing leases due to claims of the Forest Service claimed that these leases were being overgrazed, and they reduced the stocking rates allowed on these grazing leases. And the courts essentially, they found that language such as that which will best meet the needs of the American people and making the judicious use of the land can hardly be considered concrete limits upon agency discretion. Rather, it breeds discretion at every pore. So that's kind of where we're going. This FLPMA multiple use mandate, it breeds discretion at every pore. Yeah. So, and then, the courts also stated that the courts are not at liberty to break the tie by choosing one theory of range management as superior to another. So the courts reference the multiple use sustainable yield language of 1960, but they cite that, the courts could not say on whether the changes to the grazing capacity were in line with multiple use. They could only narrowly review the decision via judicial review and under the arbitrary and capricious standard, specifically looking at the agency's factual findings of overgrazing and if they rationally decided to reduce the allowable stocking rate. BLM, by adopting conservation as a multiple use, the Secretary is managing the public lands and their various resource values so that they're utilized in a combination that will best meet the present and future needs of the American people. It is at the discretion and expertise of the agency that conservation is a multiple use, meeting the broad definition found in FLPMA. So yeah, I guess when I went with the Perkins v. Birkeland case is the courts, it's at the discretion of the agency to decide if conservation is a good use, through the discretion provided in FLPMA and the multiple use mandate. The courts can't really say if conservation's a better use of the land than grazing or mining or recreation. I don't know. Yeah, I guess regulation. Well, who knows? The land's. No, I'm not gonna go down the rabbit hole there, but so essentially the courts under the standard of review that the courts are under, the arbitrary and capricious, it's very narrow. Like in the Birkeland case, Perkins versus Birkeland case, where they could only really look at did the agency come to a rational, is there evidence, rational evidence that the agency came to the right decision to reduce grazing. They can't decide. They're not the range master who can decide, if grazing's better than conservation use. So I think FLPMA and the multiple use mandate does provide that discretion to the agency on what meets a what could be defined as a multiple use. Describe 2 provisions found in FLIPMA that can be used to advocate for and or achieve conservation-oriented outcomes on public lands. So let's see, first one here I got FLIPMA, Section 202C, Part C, number 3, give priority to the designation and protection of areas of critical environmental concern. So these are, this defined areas of critical environmental concern are areas within the public lands where special management attention is required to protect and prevent irreparable damage to important historic, cultural, or scenic values, fish and wildlife resources, and or other natural systems or processes, to protect life and safety from natural hazards. So essentially, while drafting an RMP, they have to identify these areas of critical environmental concern, and then in the plan they have to provide these areas with protections to ensure that the values are not damaged, and this might allow certain uses within the area. So yeah, that I think that's one provision that's definitely got a bit of a conservation oriented outcome. And then I also have FLIPMA Section 202 Part C number 7, which states to weigh the long-term benefits to the public against short-term benefits. Is that really what that stated? Weigh long-term benefits to the public against short-term benefits. But anyway, yeah, so this is another one where that they have to consider when they're drafting a management plan for a given area. It forces the agency to look at, or to consider, long-term benefits, I think, or effects even, of a certain management decision. And while opening an area up to grazing may be beneficial in the short run, is it going to be beneficial in the long run, or could it maybe eventually over time not be? I don't know, that sounded weird. But yeah, I think that's how I interpreted that. And I think that one's got a bit of a conservation-oriented outcome as well, just because it's weighing not just short-term benefits, but long-term benefits that could be obtained. FLIPMA, unnecessary or undue degradation provision. How has this statutory provision been used in the past in the context of hard rock mining on federal lands? So it's, throughout history, like I think I kind of stated this earlier, but this definition, the definition of this is changed via, who's in the executive in charge and the policies of that executive. I think the big one in the book that we go over, and I think we even talked about in class, was with the Clinton administration had this, they changed the 3809 rule, and they put in a new definition for unnecessary or undue degradation that essentially stated conditions, activity, practices that result in substantial, irreparable harm that cannot be mitigated. So this allowed this gave the BLM a lot more discretion to prohibit mining operations that would otherwise be in compliance with the relevant environmental laws if the BLM determined that it broke the new definition. So yeah, this change in the regulation gave the BLM more discretion to control over mining. But then shortly after, once the Bush administration came in, they repealed it, they changed this definition. I can't remember what exactly they removed from it, but they did change it, so it knocked back the discretion that the BLM had. So anyways, yeah, with that unnecessary or undue degradation clause, like I said, that was like the prime, the base example they stated, but it's just like it changes depending on who's running the show. A common statement made by the courts when reviewing either federal land policy and FLIPMA, or the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, is that multiple use mandate breathes discretion at every pore. What do they mean by this statement? Breathes discretion at every pore. The courts essentially mean that the multiple use mandates only offer broad and general phrases expressing concern and desire for the environment. The mandates offer a lot of discretion to the agencies in the planning process for land use. And I also got the case here, NRDC versus Hodel, where the courts do not have say over how an agency manages for multiple use. They're judges, not range masters. Courts only have say if the agency came to a management decision in an arbitrary and capricious way, lack of properly reasoned and informed decision making. What are the primary purposes of the National Forest Service Organic Act, 1897? So, yeah, I guess, Gifford Pinchot, he was kind of based on his wise use philosophy, and that Forest Service land should not be locked up. And it was also pretty motivated by, I think Grover Cleveland was kind of going off with, he was making a bunch of national forest lands and just going nuts with it. And so essentially they had to Congress kind of decided to step in and limit it a little bit. And essentially the three main goals, though, of the Organic Act are to improve and protect forests, securing favorable conditions of water flows, and providing a continuous source of timber, which that would kind of be the big one. That really was a big driver for at least until, I don't know, a good part, or at least until starting post World War II, I think, was when that production really started to ramp up until the 80s, 90s. Briefly stated, how did the conflict over the Bitterroot and or the Monongahela National Forest lead to reform of National Forest Law and passage of NIFMA? Describe one detailed provision of NIFMA for illustration. So I just went with the Monongahela. Man, I feel like I'm probably saying that wrong. The West Virginia National Forest case. This was a challenging of 3 timber sales in which 420 acres of that would be clear cut. So the Forest Service, in that challenge, it was that the Forest Service had violated the sales provision and language of the Organic Act of 1897. And prior to this case, and then also the Bitterroot, clear cutting was the go-to for a lot of the timber sales and harvesting activities. I guess just to set the scene a little bit, clear cutting was the big, the go-to. But anyway, so the charge was that the Forest Service had violated sales provision and language in the Organic Act of 1897 too, that simply stated that trees can be sold and cut only if they are dead, matured, or large growth, and may be sold only when the sale serves the purpose of preserving and promoting the younger growth of timber on the national forest. And then the court went on to define, some of the key terms in that. So dead, they defined, dictionary. They pulled out dictionary definitions here. But dead, deprived of life. Mature, completeness of growth and development. And then large, exceeding most other things of like kind and bulk. However, the Forest Service had been interpreting large growth not on the individual level, like an individual tree being large growth. They just interpreted it and were using that large growth clause as meaning large growth as in a large stand of trees, a lot of growth, I guess. So that was kind of how they were able to get into that timber sale, authorize these timber sales by interpreting large growth as that, as on the stand level, not the individual tree level. And then also they weren't marking timber before it was being sold. Also, that was also a violation of the Organic Act. So what ends up happening is, in the results of this case, it results in an essential ban on clear cutting by defining what large growth means, and defining these terms textbook definition, dictionary definition. And so Congress kind of responds to this by wanting to limit, because I think, in the book it said they knew that this ban on clear cutting from this case probably wasn't going to hold up. So Congress stepped in to limit clear cutting as well. And so they passed NIFMA in 1976 to regulate and establish standards for land resource management plans. And in NIFMA Section 6, there's a specific clear cutting provision, which essentially states, ensure that clear cutting, seed tree cutting, shelter wood cutting, and other cuts designed to regenerate an even age stand of timber will be used as a cutting method on national forest lands only where, for clear cutting, it is determined to be the optimum method, and for other cuts it is determined to be appropriate to meet the objectives and requirements of the relative land management plan. So this new provision kind of adds more stipulations, or quite a bit more, to when clear cutting. It doesn't outright ban clear cutting, but it's it definitely adds more to, it limits clear cutting to be used only when it is the optimum method. Now, I'm not really sure, I guess, Yeah, only when it would be the optimum method. And then there's also another clause in there where I don't know if I got it on here anywhere, but yeah, I'm not going to go into it because I'm kind of running out of time. But so, what are the most significant ways that the National Forest Management Act of 1976 constrained the amount of discretion the U.S. Forest Service had under the 1897 Organic Act and the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960? Please be sure to discuss the issue of wildlife somewhere in your response. So, NIFMA in 1976, you know, it. Okay, yeah. NIFMA 1976, essentially, biggest thing, it requires each national forest or grassland in the National Forest Service to write a land resource management plan. And these, so it was kind of a three-tiered approach. So, tier one, you got the national NIFMA regulations, which govern the development of forest level plans. Tier two, you got your forest level plans, which regulate activities within a forest area. And these provide long-term goals and desired future conditions. And then tier three, you got your site-specific projects under NIFMA must be consistent with the goals of the forest plan. And then also included in NIFMA is you got this wildlife diversity mandate. There had been no obligations for wildlife diversity or even like wildlife management in in the Organic Act or the Multiple Use Sustainable Yield Act. That was introduced in NIFMA where they actually had the wildlife diversity mandate, which requires forest plans to provide for a diversity of plant and animal communities based on the suitability and capability of the specific land area in order to meet overall multiple use objectives. So yeah, this was like a substantive and enforceable requirement for the Forest Service, which something that wasn't found in previous Organic Act or multiple use sustained yield. And then section also another thing that NIFMA does that kind of that constrains the discretion is NIFMA required that the Secretary of Section 6 Part H, the Secretary of Agriculture is required to appoint a committee of scientists that are not Forest Service employees to provide technical and scientific information on proposed guidelines and procedures. And I think I don't know if there was a stipulation on how often they meet, but I think it was supposed to be like at least like 16 years or something like that. Or they've met a couple of times. I think it's been a while though since they have. But essentially, this group of scientists was kind of meant to come in and maybe I guess also kind of avoid that maybe agency capture, those special interests as well, being outside of the Forest Service. But even like this, this resulted also in more regulations towards wildlife. So this here has specifically led to regulations that require the maintenance of habitat to ensure viable species within an area, viable populations of species within an area. That was like a specific example, but this further kind of that section 6H further kind of limits discretion by having these outsiders come in to help to provide scientific and technical guidance on potential regulations pursuant to NIFMA. Oh, I think this might be the last one that I got to possibly. Let's see. Land and resource management plans, forest plans prepared by the Forest Service. What is the National Forest NIFMA's plans consistency provision? So the plan consistency provision of NIFMA section 6, Part H, essentially is that resource plans, permits, contracts, and other instruments for the use of occupancy of National Forest System lands shall be consistent with the land management plans. So like those, I think kind of goes back to even like I think like those third tier project level stuff have to be in line with the second tier, and then the second tier stuff has to be in line with tier one. So the project site specific plans have to be consistent with the forest plans, and then the forest plans have to be consistent with the NIFMA regulations, and the NIFMA regulations have to be consistent with the NIFMA statutory requirements. So that it's kind of like a tiering essentially of planning has to be. It places limits on planning, I guess. Going all the way up to those statutory requirements of NIFMA. What are management area / area designation / zones as found in the land and resource management plans? Okay, So this one I just kind of got to a little bit before I started in here, and this is stuff we haven't gotten to forest service planning or anything yet in class. So I'm a little bit in uncharted waters here, but essentially management areas and zones are required for their they're required for approval of an LRMP, and their area prescriptions applying to future activities in that management area, resource integration and minimum specific management requirements. They're essentially, I guess, like zoning ordinances under which future decisions would be made. And I think like there was a map, and they're like within a national forest, you got these management areas or zones, and I guess within those, so like going along with this, they would be like, there's maybe certain requirements or specifications within those zones that need to be, identified or followed, zoning ordinances under which future, so there might be more specific requirements for those areas. Okay. So definitely kind of a shaky first run. And like I said, this one's definitely a bit more challenging than the first one, or at least I had a little more tough with it. And I'm still not done, and there's a couple I definitely need to go back in here and rework. But, yeah, so exam, couple weeks out yet. Pretty much about 2 weeks out. A little under 2 weeks, I guess. But so I'm just going to keep doing this. I'll probably do some more episodes. This one ran pretty long, so I'm going to wrap it up. I got to hit the restroom. Yeah. I'll put up the information in the bio description of the book and textbook and the class information and stuff. But yeah, study guide walkthrough of exam number 2. Thanks. Bye.